All right, well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Science on the Sound lecture series. My name is Joe Hoyt, and I'm thrilled to be here tonight. I'm glad to see so many people came out. You've got just an incredible amount of history here on the Outer Banks, so it's really wonderful to see so many people recognizing that and want to spend their time learning a little bit more about the incredible things that are off your shores here. I work for the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries in the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and we have the rare privilege of protecting special places in the oceans. The National Marine Sanctuaries is somewhat similar to national parks in that we have these 15 sites throughout the U.S. Waters and territorial waters that protect these iconic places in our seas. Many of those are focused on the natural environment, but we also have many that focus on the historical environment. So the shipwrecks and maritime heritage and the cultural landscapes that are so important to people that live along the shores. The site that I've been working at for the last 10 years, and I've had the privilege to partner with folks here at Coastal Studies Institute, is at the Monitor National Marine Sanctuary, where we manage the site of the Civil War ironclad USS Monitor that's lost off the coast of North Carolina. But we have a broader program in NOAA that focuses on maritime heritage throughout the national system. So I'm currently acting as the National Maritime Heritage Coordinator in that capacity. So we've been managing the site of the Monitor since the mid-70s, but over the last 10 years or so, we've really begun looking at this broader story of maritime heritage off the coast of North Carolina, and that's what I'm going to talk to you guys about tonight. So I just have a question. You guys can shout it out if something comes to mind. When you think of World War II history and you think of places, what kind of places pop to your head? Germany? Pacific? Normandy? Iwo Jima? All these places. That's exactly right. I mean, when people think of World War II, they think of these faraway places. It's something that happened over there. It's something that was a foreign war. You know, at the beginning of World War II, America didn't really particularly want to be involved in another world war. So this idea of it happening in these faraway places is really what still is rooted in the minds of many Americans today. But in reality, there was an American theater of World War II that hasn't really received its fair share of credit in the story that it tells, and that is the story of the Battle of the Atlantic. So in really rough terms, the Battle of the Atlantic is what you would call a war on commerce. Following the end of World War I, Germany, it was pretty clear after the Battle of Jutland and other engagements that Germany wasn't really going to have the capacity to compete on the high seas with the British Navy. And in the interwar period, they began developing more and more U-boat technology and things if they're not able to compete head-to-head in a traditional naval engagement, what they can do is they can cut off the flow of supplies to the UK. So, if the UK and Britain it's an island nation, right? So everything that they have in this period to fuel that war machine has to be shipped in from somewhere else. So predominantly those are things like finished goods, but really it's raw materials. So fuel and other consumables that are used to kind of fuel that war machine. It's really, if you think of fuel oil in particular as a major artery that pumped life into the ability of the Allied war effort. And where does a huge amount of fuel come from? Right, the Gulf of Mexico and up the East Coast. So what's happening here is ships coming into the European theater and the German Kriegsmarine trying to cut off that supply that is so critical to the war effort. And that's really what the strategic element of this area is. So you've got giant tankers coming out of the Gulf, running up the Gulf Stream along the East Coast and heading towards Europe. And that's putting fuel into the RAF planes that are making bombing raids. It's putting fuel into the tanks. They're supplying guns, they're supplying food. All these things are being shipped in. So if Germany could disrupt that was a severe blow to the ability to wage war. This is one of my favorite quotes Don't worry, I'm not going to bludgeon you with too many of these throughout the discussion. But the Battle of the Atlantic was the dominating factor all through the war. Never for one moment could we forget that everything happening elsewhere on land, at sea, or in the air depended ultimately on its outcome. That's Winston Churchill. That's how critical the Battle of the Atlantic was. It's also the longest continuous campaign of World War II, and this is one of the things, as you see later in the talk, that kind of presents us these challenges. You think of a World War II battle or a World War II battlefield as sort of these discrete events. Normandy or the D-Day landings happened, just in the course of a relatively short period of time in the scheme of the larger war. So you think of these kind of small, individual battlefields that together constitute this larger war. The Battle of the Atlantic was an ongoing campaign, so it really began at the very beginning of World War II, but years before the Americans entered, and went all the way up to the very end. For the American theater, again, we were quite isolationist at the time that World War II began and reticent to become involved. Of course, that changed on December 7th when Pearl Harbor was attacked. And by December 11th, Germany is declaring war on the United States, just a few days later. And a week after they declared war, the first U-boat set sail for the coast of the United States. So the Battle of the Atlantic was already happening before U.S. entered the war. And so the Germans were really well prepared to just shift their already active assets into combat. And by the first, second week of January, the first U-boats arrive off the American shore and start sinking their targets. And by January 18th of 1942, the first ship is sunk off the coast of North Carolina here. And this really began a 6-month period until about mid-July of 1942, where an enormous number of wrecks were sunk along the coast. And this really struck fear into the Navy and into the folks along the coastline, because this is suddenly something that seems so far away is very, very real, and the Outer Banks were at the forefront of that. In the 1940s, the Outer Banks were quite remote. They're reasonably remote in 2019. So these folks were seeing these things firsthand, and it was really kind of unrepresented in the American consciousness because there was just so much going on. But there were classic things that you hear still today: when in doubt, lights out, loose lips sink ships. All these phrases that you hear come from this campaign of these vessels being moving around and how critical they were. And what's really interesting here, and I think you'll hear as I continue to talk this evening, is the story of the Merchant Marine. One of the things that we have as an ongoing effort at NOAA is to try to protect some of these wrecks that are off your shores here and really memorialize and tell the story of the Merchant Marine, who have gotten a pretty hard shake in their role in World War II, whereas they had the highest statistical casualty rate of any of the armed services. So you're more likely to lose your life in World War II as a member of the Merchant Marine than you were if you were a Marine or in the Navy or any other branch of military service. Although they weren't recognized as veterans, they had no veteran status. They got some partial veteran status established in the 1980s, where they told a bunch of guys in their 70s that they could have the GI Bill in case they wanted to go to college, and maybe help with a loan on their first house. But it was really, these guys were really critical, and their story is really underrepresented, and it's something that I think is a really unique American story about resilience and fortitude that is best represented here off the East Coast. So, as I said, we had this 6-month period of time where ships are being sunk with relative impunity, and we have this perspective of America being the mightiest player in World War II. So why did we have this period where we're losing so many ships? And again, part of that is that the support for the war, at least initially, was in the Pacific theater. We just suffered the Pearl Harbor attacks. Many of the naval assets that we did have on hand at that time were allocated to the Pacific theater, and many of the assets that we had leading up to this period were sort of shifted already over to the British under Lend-Lease and other programs that allowed our allies to have access to some of those vessels, but really left us relatively protected along the East Coast. We did a number of things that are significant to this area, some failed countermeasures. One is setting up mines, sea mines in the area to try to protect some of the vessels as they're transiting up and down the coast. This is a really interesting case. There was only a couple of places in the entire U.S. where they try to do this. One here out of Ocracoke, and you'll still see it on the modern charts if you're out on the water. It's marked as a danger area. They put out a couple thousand Mark VI mines to create a sort of a temporary anchorage for transiting vessels. And they also set up a minefield in the Florida Keys. Unfortunately, all these defensive minefields ever did was sink our own ships, so they were pretty quickly removed. But there's a few shipwrecks that are off the coast here that are a result of this minefield. This is the FW Abrams that, if you guys are into diving along the shores here, it's a really beautiful site to visit. So really for this 6-month window, we were trying things like that. We're throwing up defensive minefields, but all the while we're actively working towards reinstituting a convoy system. We'd learned from World War I that convoy systems were effective. It just took us a little bit of time to get coordinated and get the assets that we need to do this. In the interim, really any ship that was available was put into service. So this is fishing trawlers, private yachts on donation, slap on a deck gun, some depth charge racks and send it out to sea. And so it really it really sort of represented the resilience of this period and the unpreparedness that was there. And the end result of this engagement, at least as it's represented off of the coast of North Carolina, was just in this short window of time, 91 ships were lost alone off the Carolinas. 79 merchant ships, 8 Allied naval ships, that's British and American predominantly, and 4 German U-boats. Out of that number, 1,657 were casualties occurred just off of North Carolina, and 1,200 of those were merchant mariners. So this area is truly a submerged grave. It's a war grave. It's a battlefield. And it's a place of just immense meaning. And so what we've begun doing is over the last 10 years, in partnership with CSI and a number of other folks in the region, other federal agencies, East Carolina University, we've begun this comprehensive inventory of these World War II wrecks to better understand what's out there and how this is represented. And in the process of that, I've begun understanding this area really as a battlefield and trying to interpret it as such. And we're really at this interesting time where if you look out on the sea, what's one of the main characteristics when you look out, stand on the beach and you look out at the ocean? It's just vast, right? It's just this open, sort of featureless expanse. And when you think of a battlefield, if you go to a place like Gettysburg or Shiloh or Little Bighorn, you see features in the landscape, an area high ground, maybe a trench, a tree line, some of these features in the landscape that you can understand how troops would move within it and how they would operate and how the terrain, how the landscape would influence tactics, right? And that's what we would call battlefield archaeology. So we've begun approaching the naval battlefield of the Battle of the Atlantic off North Carolina in this same way that you would look at it on land, but having to tweak it a little bit. And we're in this really exciting time in this type of research because for the first time, we're able to visualize these in a different way. So we're able to go out there with divers, with human-occupied vehicles, with remotely operated vehicles, with autonomous vehicles, with cameras, with lasers, with acoustic stuff, all these things that we have at our fingertips now, that we can visualize these things, sort of virtually raise them, interpret the relationship to one another geospatially, and for the first time, kind of peel back the ocean, peel back that sort of featureless landscape, and understand why this area is really significant and why it is really unique. Because although it looks featureless, there are all these elements of the landscape that tactically influence the battlefield and why this particular area is so significant. So a number of those things are, one, the shipping lanes. You got to have ships to sink, right? If that's your goal. So historically, this area, even prior to World War II, was always a historic thoroughfare. So from the colonial period onward, ships would come up using the Gulf Stream up along the East Coast, and the Gulf Stream kind of it's a perfect natural moving walkway that sends you back over to Europe. So this was a natural shipping lane. And then if you look here, you've got this little line represents the continental shelf. And because the east coast of the United States is a divergent zone, the continental shelf up here is pretty wide. So you've got a high concentration of shipping that's up off of the New York and Boston Harbor and all this area. But because you've got this really wide shelf, the water depth is quite shallow, hundreds of miles offshore. You can see how far it is here. Now here, off Hatteras, the continental shelf comes very close. It's the closest point on the East Coast. So you get this bottleneck of shipping. And the way that the U-boats like to operate was they wanted to have a high concentration of shipping where they wanted access to deep water to evade counterattack. Right? So they could come in here and attack ships, but then be able to get into deep water, whereas up here, they were vulnerable. So interestingly, the U-boats, we believed at the time, early in the war, that there's no way that the Germans could build a submarine that was capable of diving deeper than our American subs, which at the time was about 250 feet operationally. While the German subs could dive to about 750 feet. So how do you think we designed our depth charges? We designed them to operate up to about 250 feet. So they really like this deep water. And so there's all these other features in the landscape as well. The water temperature. Why might water temperature have some sort of operational impact on U-boat activity? Any ideas? Buoyancy, maybe. But have you ever gone on the beach at night and when it's nice and warm and kicked your foot through the surf and bioluminescence, right? So at night, if you're down in these warmer waters, you could see you were easy to spot from aircraft, and a lot of this activity was happening from winter time up through spring. So the waters were quite cool farther north. But it's really interesting because you had, up until this time period, really World War I, World War II, a naval battlefield really took place on that flat planar surface, right? If you had two ships with cannons and sails and they're battling each other, they have to, the weather is a factor, the wind direction, these sorts of things, maybe the shoreline, but in general, the activity is happening on that planar surface of the sea. But here, now we have U-boats that are operating in that water column, so they're interacting with the contours of the seabed. The bathymetry itself is a factor. You also have aircraft, so in that atmospheric column, you've got operational limits of those aircraft, how far they can see, where their bases are, what the weather conditions are, and then you still have this planar surface. So we've gone, in a short period of time, a naval battlefield was, this kind of two-dimensional thing to really this 3D landscape, but it's also really hard to get your head around. So that's what a lot of our research is focused on, is trying to capture these stories and be able to articulate why this area is a battlefield and why this area, we think, is a significant enough battlefield for the American story to be remembered and protected. And again, this is it's a story of North Carolina, it's a story of America, but it's also a story of the world. And if you look at the ships that are off the coast here, the majority of them are American vessels, but you've got Yugoslavian, Soviet vessels, Panamanian vessels, Norwegian, Nicaraguan, Latvian, Greek, German, British, Belgian, Brazilian. It is a world war and it is represented here. These nations are all, these are shipwrecks and ships that were attacked off our shores that are still represented here in this really amazing collection. Now, I should say one of the great things about this area being so strategically valuable is because you had these shallow water shipping lanes, high concentration shipping. What is good about shallow water? Hal and Penny know. We can go there, right? As shipwrecks, we can go, as researchers, we can visit these places. The diving community can visit these places. The fishing community can visit all these places. It's really just a tremendous resource that we have off the coast here. Again, so we've taken a lot of this data, all these ships that have been attacked or have been sunk. We've modeled it, tried to understand sort of geospatially where the density of the battle, where these strategic hotspots of activity were. That's what this image is showing you here. And have really tried to kind of understand how can we communicate this idea of a battlefield most effectively. And then we go out and have the privilege of visiting some of these unique and beautiful sites and document them and try to tell these stories and try to share this history. These are some photo mosaics that we've done years ago, and I've sort of set this up to sort of show you the evolution of some of the things that we've done to capture these images. These are a series of photographs that are sort of stitched together to create an image of the wreck. This is the U-85. How many people here are familiar with the U-85? A few? That's about 14 miles from where we are right now, that wreck. They're just out of Oregon Inlet. And that is about half of my commute to work every day. That's how close these things were and remain to us here in the States. And then we go out and do detailed drawings of these sites, pull divers down there, pulling little tiny measurements, understanding exactly what the state of preservation is. We're beholden to some National Historic Preservation laws to record these in a particular way and start to begin to track impacts, both natural and human impacts that happen to these sites over time. But in order to do that, we sort of need to develop these baseline data sets. So that's what we've really been focusing on for the last 10 years or so. And we're getting better and better at that. This is an example of, this is a great story. So this is a cool image of photogrammetry is a mouthful, but it's a kind of a new emerging critical element in recording shipwreck sites. And what this allows you to do is take a series of 1,000 or 2,000 images and process them all together and reference them to one another and create a 3D model of the wreck itself in a really pretty short amount of time. So this site's in about 320 feet of water, and the images to create this 3D model were done in a single 30-minute dive, and then we're able to have this kind of permanent, really detailed record of the site. Now the story of this site, this is called the USS YP-389, and this is just a fantastic story that really sort of is very typical of the Battle of the Atlantic. And this was a North Sea fishing trawler, or New England fishing trawler, excuse me. A New England fishing trawler called the Cohasset that was pressed into service and turned into a yard patrol boat and set out to essentially, remember that minefield that was accidentally sinking all of our boats? They said, oh, we better put somebody out there to warn these guys of the entrance to this minefield. So these guys were out there, basically on patrol, making sure that nobody got into this minefield. And as a result, a U-boat that was operating in the area kept seeing this little patrol craft and believed, they must be tracking me in some way, not realizing that they're just, kind of going back and forth. So they, rather than expend one of their limited torpedoes, they engaged in about an hour-and-a-half long surface fight with this little 100-foot-long yard patrol boat that resulted in the loss of 6 U.S. sailors, and the U-boat was successful in sinking it. But we got it. A couple weeks later, we sunk the 701, also off North Carolina. So we were able to go out and capture these types of stories and these images. This is an example of multi-beam sonar that we do off of some of our NOAA vessels. This is a wreck called the British Splendor. That was a tanker that was sunk, again, just off of the Hatteras area in about a little less than 100 feet of water. And again, beautiful dive site, wonderful place to visit. But these allow us to get these really cool snapshots in time of what these things look like. Again, this is a multi-beam sonar image that we've used to locate the site of the YP-389. And there's varying degrees of quality of multi-beam. This is a kind of a wide area search. This is a more detailed, high-resolution multi-beam. And then that allows us to get back down on these sites and really zero in and collect the imagery and the data that we need to be able to tell that story. Obviously, one of the things that helped us identify that little boat was the presence of this 3-inch 23 caliber deck gun that is generally not on a fishing trawler. Probably some fishing trawlers, but we thought that's got to be it. So again, this is just a really great story because it shows the how we were adapting vessels that really weren't intended for use during the early part of our engagement in the Battle of the Atlantic, but we're still out there doing the job and sacrificing to keep the country safe. Again, this is the crew list of the guys off the YP-389 that were lost. So we had, just to give you an example of the progression of quality, this was in 2009 when we relocated the site of the YP-389. We had a sort of lower resolution camera system that we were able to stitch together a photo mosaic. And then in 2016, working with Project Baseline, an avocational and volunteer group of divers, they were able to get this much more detailed image. And it's hard to tell at this scale where you're sitting, but if you zoom in on this, you can see just the tiniest, things the size of my thumbnail. It's incredibly detailed. So I talked a lot and really quickly about this idea of a battlefield and how it's this large area over this extended period of time. And how do you really kind of capture that notion of a battlefield? And in our research, we found one of the coolest stories was this battle of KS-520, this one particular convoy battle that happened off the coast of North Carolina on July 15th of 1942. And this really kind of bookends that period of time from the beginning of January till mid-July of the Battle of the Atlantic off of North Carolina. So really after this, the German Kriegsmarine, the U-boat arm, they recognized that we had gotten so good at anti-submarine warfare that they really removed their focus off the East Coast. They set some things down into the Gulf of Mexico. They maintained a presence, but effectively off of our shores here, this was the end of the U-boat war off of North Carolina. There's still some some activity, but this was the major bookend to that 6-month window. And we thought, man, if we could find this site, what a great way to help us tell this story. But at the time, it was unknown, and the story of KS-520 is really interesting. It was a convoy. KS-520 is a convoy designation that stands for Key West South. It's the KS, Key West South. And they assembled 19 ships in Norfolk, and then we're heading down to Key West. And this is roughly the assembly of the vessels. So the merchant vessels were escorted by 5 military vessels made up of Coast Guard and Navy surface vessels, as well as aircraft. There were some Navy Kingfisher aircraft that were also escorting the convoy. So this is really organized. We've gotten our act together, and we're not taking any gruff at this point. And so these guys assembled on the 14th of July and began moving south, escorted by these vessels. Now, as I said, we're getting better by this time, and a few days prior to this, the U-576 had reported back to U-boat base in France that it had sustained some damage from an aerial bombardment. It reported some damage to its ballast system and was unsure whether or not it was going to be able to continue the fight. That's really kind of the last we hear of the 576, but we know at that time that they moved over 100 miles offshore, and they must have felt that they fixed whatever problem they identified enough, because they came back inshore and on the 15th intercepted the KS-520 convoy and lined up for a full attack in the middle of the afternoon on these ships. So a Type 7C U-boat, which is what the U-576 was, they had 4 bow tubes, 4 torpedo tubes in the bow, and they launched a textbook attack, launched a full bow salvo of 4 torpedoes spread into this convoy. They were lined up, we believe, I've got a slide later on that'll show you, but they were kind of over in this region, and they fired into the convoy, striking the flagship, the J.A. Mowinkle, the Chaleur, which is, the Chaleur is here, the J.A. Mowinkle, and then the Bluefields was struck with the 4th torpedo. So all 4 torpedoes found their target. One of the vessels was hit twice. Now, the Mowinkle and the Chaleur, they were sailing in ballast, which is to say they didn't have any cargo at the time. They were on their way to pick up cargo. And if you didn't have a full load, you were less likely to sink. So these vessels didn't actually sink. They were damaged, and they limped out of the field of fire and unfortunately directly into our minefield where they struck mines again. And, but the freighter Bluefields was a smaller ship, and it was sunk immediately. Again, this is the minefield. This is a map of the minefield off of Ocracoke and Hatteras area. Now, the Mowinkle and the Chaleur, they spent a few days in that area trying to be assisted. There's a small wreck that's out there called the Kashina. It was a rescue tug contracted by the Navy to try to pull these vessels out. That vessel struck a mine when it was trying to assist these and is still sunk there today where this was occurring. The Mowinkle never did sink. It was able to get back up to Norfolk and was refitted. The Chaleur was towed almost back to Norfolk and sunk just on the approaches of the Chesapeake Bay. So it was lost, but not here. But the Bluefields was lost immediately. Now, what we think happened is as soon as these, this convoy's sailing south, everything's going fine, and then all of a sudden you've got 3 ships on fire, and immediately after that, the U-boat popped to the surface in the center of the convoy, which is the exact opposite of what you want to do with a U-boat, right? U-boat's supposed to go under the water. And what we think happened is the U-boat had reported some damage a few days prior to its ballast system, and what it is likely is that when it suddenly lost all the weight of those torpedoes, it wasn't able to appropriately compensate for that loss of weight, and it popped to the surface. Well, as soon as it popped to the surface, there was an armed guard crew, a naval armed guard crew aboard the Unicoi, a merchant ship, that immediately opened fire, claiming a direct hit. And those 2 Navy Kingfisher aircraft swooped in and straddled it with depth charges. So in about a 15-minute window, everything is calm to you've got 3 ships on fire and the U-boat sunk in a pretty small area. So we thought, this is just a great example of this idea of a battlefield where you have both the sort of the victim and the aggressor all sort of represented, but we didn't know where it was. So we decided that this would be a good thing to begin to study, to again apply this battlefield archaeology to try to understand these sites in that more comprehensive and broad way, and then hopefully locate these sites as well. So we partnered with East Carolina University. They were successful in getting a grant through the American Battlefield Protection Program to conduct this assessment of of the battlefield. So this consisted of digital reconstructions of fields of view that aircraft would have had. How far could the periscope see at periscope depth? What are the operational limits of a torpedo from a German submarine? All these different factors we began to sort of model out and understand where this was happening. Now, of course, it's all theoretical until we know exactly where these vessels are. But this gave us a sort of an understanding of where the ships were in this convoy. So these little green dots represent the vessels, the merchant vessels. The 3 red dots are the 3 ships that were attacked. And then the green ones, or the yellow ones are the escort vessels. And then this is our best guess of where the U-boat would have been based on its operational limitations. Of course, we then began trying to locate these sites. These are images of the crew of the U-576 who were all lost on that day. To locate the sites, we were presented with some problems and challenges. We worked with a grad student at East Carolina University who developed these probability models based on where the convoys would have been routed. Some of these features in the landscape, you can see this little yellow blurb out here is we know where the minefield was. We know that the Mowinkle and the Chaleur were towed into the minefield. So that's this is sort of a heat map probability model that was developed. And again, this is that same map prioritized. Now, one of the challenges that we had here is if you see these little triangles, these are all historically reported positions. So there were 5 escort vessels and 2 aircraft, all of which are required to file after-action reports after an engagement like this, and they all did. Good for them. The unfortunate thing is they're all describing the same exact event that only happened in one place, and when you plot out where each one of them said it was, it covers about a 300 square mile area. So these guys over here, the aircraft, they didn't know where they were. And then these are the surface vessels. So we took all that along with what we knew of the convoy routes. We knew that generally it would follow the 100-fathom curve line, so we've modeled that in there. And from that, we get this search area, which we spent a couple of years using various pieces of technology trying to locate. This is a forward-looking sonar system that we used. Now, this number 1 box is number 1 priority area, and you'd ask yourself, well, why didn't you finish this corner of the number 1 priority area? Well, there's just limitations of the vehicle. That's kind of following the edge of the continental shelf, so we kind of pushed it to the operational limit that we could for the system that we had at that time, and then worked with other systems over the years to kind of chip away at this survey area. Again, I don't know why, we kept on missing this one little corner. Where do you think we found it? So if you look right here in this tiny little white tip, about 100 feet from where we first looked for it is where we found it. So we would spend a couple of seasons looking at these wide area surveys, and then there's a trade-off in sonar essentially. If you want to see far, you're seeing fuzzy. If you want to see detail, you're not seeing far at all. So it's sort of the difference between like a spotlight and a wide beam, and so it makes it challenging and time-consuming to do. And in the course of this, we found several targets. At one point, we had over 50 targets that were potential wrecks, and we'd have to go back and evaluate some of those. For example, this is another shipwreck that we found off the coast here that we still don't know the identity of this site, but this gives you an example of the difference between sort of that wide area survey where you see a little smudge like this, and this, just to give you an appreciation for the current out there, we almost didn't mark this because it's so large. This is almost a mile long here, and we thought, well, it's a geological feature. Well, it is, but it's a geological feature because the wreck is here, and the current is so strong it created this scour pattern behind it that stretches much larger than the actual vessel. So this, with a detailed survey, is what the actual shipwreck looks like, and you can see a lot more It's a broken in half ship, it's got a fantail, and you can see that it's got a pilot house. So that's kind of the difference between the two levels of detail that we could get. Ultimately, here we are. We were successful. We thought, well, let's try to find the Nicaraguan freighter, the Bluefields, first, because it'll be a bigger target, it'll stick up a lot higher, and if we can find that, then we can zero in on finding the U-boat. We thought that might shrink our search area to maybe a couple of miles. We thought, how cool would it be if these were just a few miles apart? And so we were successful in doing that. Back in 2014, we got a target that seemed to line up from our side scan survey with historical images. The size, the general dimensions looked like it was a good ringer for the Bluefields. But of course, it was the last day of the survey, last day of the year, and that was the last survey line that we ran. So that was all we had. And we had NOAA has a large fleet of research vessels that are often transiting around doing other work. And I had a call from one of my colleagues there that said, hey, we got the Okeanos Explorers transiting through North Carolina. Is there anything you want us to take a look at? And I sent him the numbers from this and said, if you got us, take a look around this area here, a couple miles around this area, and see if there's anything else there. And they sent me back this image. And this is the target for the Bluefields. And then I said, well, there's this bump over here. It's only 240 meters away, so a couple football fields away. And I thought, there's no way. It's got to be a piece of the same wreck. So I had to stare at this for a year before we could get back out on the water to see what this little bump is. And when we got out there, this is what we found. So it was the only time that you could definitively identify a shipwreck based on sonar. So I don't know, what do you think? Does it look like a U-boat? So this was obviously very exciting. This is a high-resolution multi-beam image that was collected from an autonomous underwater vehicle. And then now that we found these sites, we wanted to get back and do detailed documentation of this battlefield site, again centered around sort of developing this area and interpreting it as a national battlefield. To do that, we used human-occupied vehicles. This is a two-man Triton submersible that's capable of 1,000 feet of depth. This was graciously supported by some of our partners at Global Underwater Explorers and Project Baseline. And they had this vehicle, and I had worked with some other partners, and I said, I like your vehicle. Can I strap on all these heavy toys? So we put a laser scanner and a Doppler velocity lock and USBL and all these instruments that would allow us to really document these sites in a really high level of detail. So we did that in the summer of 2016, and were able to visit this battlefield site for the first time since they were lost in 1942. So this is the U-576. This is the conning tower area. The preservation on the site is unbelievable. It's in about 700 feet of water. And because it's in that deep of water, it's really a really stable environment. So the only thing that that is not on this vessel that would have been on there when it was afloat are some guardrails and some guy wires that ran fore and aft. But otherwise, it's completely intact. This is the 88 millimeter deck gun. Over here is the ready ammunition locker, still sealed. And one of the first things that we were looking for is trying to determine whether or not, what sunk the vessel. Was it the deck gun from the Unicoi? Was it the aircraft? And because it's so intact that we really could see no evidence of what sunk it. No definitive evidence. So this is visiting the site, and one of the first things we looked for was whether or not the hatch covers were open or closed. They did have the ability to escape through the water column, or attempt to escape through the water column, and we could see that all the hatch covers were closed. At that time, we knew that there were 45 German sailors still entombed inside. It's a very solemn place, and here's the 576. And we had two submersibles, so I'm in this one, and John back there waving is the one who took this picture in the other submersible. So I have a short video to give you an idea of what these places are like. Now, the most amazing thing was to be, you dropping through the water column. First, you're dangling from the ship, which is quite terrifying, and you're in a little greenhouse that's about 400 degrees. And then you drop through, here's the laser scanner on the side here with a company called 2G Robotics. Now, for the laser scanner to work, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, you had to have really good positioning, and that's what all of those other instruments are. So you drop through the water column, and it's silent, and to save batteries, you're basically just falling. And you get to the bottom, and one of the first things that we saw was the 576. Now, it's just unbelievable how intact it is. It's the design of these vessels were such that they had these saddle tanks that ran amidships. So the bow and the stern are actually sitting up off the bottom. If you were free swimming, you could swim underneath the vessel. It's like sitting on, it's almost like it's on display. Just unbelievable. This is the conning tower here with these big snowy grouper hanging out in there. It's hard to see how dark this is here, but if you see this little blue flashy light here, that's the laser scanning system in action. This is the stern assembly of the 576, the rudders, the props, the diving planes, all perfectly intact, no discernible damage. And then when you're tired of looking at the U-boat, you hang a right and swim 200 yards, and out of the gloom comes the blue fields. And again, this is amazingly intact. The pilot house is still there. Everything is still there, just like it was lost in 1942. Obviously, this one you can see the damage. It's cracked in half, but it's still intact. There's a couple of trucks strapped down to the deck. It was a general purpose freighter. And all of this stuff is just still sitting there. It's just this complete sense of awe to see this place. What's different about, a battlefield here versus a battlefield that you might go visit in, a place like Manassas is that those places are kind of curated and they're mowed and they've been used since they were last a battlefield. These places, with the exception of some marine growth, are exactly like they were when they were lost in 1942, and they're just one or two, rather, of a huge collection of these sites off of the coast here that represent this battlefield. So these are some of the results. This is the laser scanning of the U-576. You can see the detail that you get from this laser scanning system. Now, getting that, it was really tricky because we had to basically set up a positioning environment on the bottom. We had to set up acoustic receivers around the entire battlefield site so that the sensor was, because you could get such high resolution with a laser scanner, you had to have equally high resolution with the positioning system. And so that was really tricky. Some of these little sort of smears that you see are grouper swimming past the sensor. Get out of the way. But again, incredible preservation. We were able to collect this out of a couple of dives, and then we have this incredibly detailed 3D representation of these sites that just a few years ago would have been impossible for us to capture, particularly in this water depth. So now we have the capacity to go out there, collect these types of things, interpret these things, and be able to share them with people. Because a lot of people along the Outer Banks are aware of this story, but you go to Ohio, where I grew up, this is mind-blowing. And it's really kind of an honor to be able to come and visit these places and share them with people. And we just think that this history is so critically important and it's so interesting. I had a really interesting experience. We had a conference. A colleague of mine from American Battlefield Protection Program was doing a presentation talking about all of the sites in our country that are honored for their place in the American story. So Revolutionary War, Spanish-American War, Civil War, all these places that are set aside that you can go visit and interpret this history. But for World War II, we have nothing in the continent of the United States except for Valor in the Pacific and in Pearl Harbor. But this place is where World War II came home, and we have not interpreted it appropriately. We've not celebrated its story or honored its story, and it's, like I said, just a few miles off of our coast here. So that's what our focus has really been over the last few years, is to try to figure out how best to honor the story of the Merchant Marine and represent this battlefield. And we're working through a process now through the National Marine Sanctuary Program to try to expand the current boundaries of the monitor, which is really kind of in the middle of where all these are, to incorporate not all of these vessels, but a representative selection of the Battle of the Atlantic. So hopefully we can continue to do these types of interpretive operations and get people to understand and appreciate just how nationally and really globally significant the Outer Banks are in the American story and in World War II history. So with that, I've just have some images here of the site, but I can answer any questions that folks might have. We do have this ongoing process to work towards establishing this. We're down here pretty often for public hearings and events and meetings, so I encourage you guys to kind of check us out online. I'll post my contact information and website up here so you can, if you're interested in learning more about what we're up to, you can do that. Is there?
Sort of three questions. One, at that choke point that you mentioned about the continental shelf, about how far out is that at that choke point and what kind of depth? Second question, on your chart of the convoy, it looked like the armed escort vehicles were on the shore side as opposed to the outside. And third, since we've just discovered this, and now that Germany is an ally, have they expressed interest into recovering the remains?
Sure. So your first question was the proximity of the continental shelf and the choke point and how close it came to the shore. So it varies a little bit, but in general, right off of Hatteras there, about 35 to 40 miles is when you start to really drop off. So a lot of these ships, out of that 90 ships that I mentioned earlier, we feel like about 50, 52 of those are likely on the shelf. The others are off in deep water. So those range in depth from 50 feet to the site that we were just showing you here, that's in about 700 feet of water. So that's, if you went another quarter mile to the east, you would drop off the edge of the shelf there. So that's about how far it comes. The other question you had about the German, Federal Republic of Germany is now currently an ally of the United States, and what interest have they had in our activity? We have, because we're a federal agency and also because it's the right thing to do, we have coordinated all of our research that was relative to the U-boats through the German embassy in DC and the German naval attaché. So we've reported out to them and made them aware of everything and gotten permission to do everything that we've done there. And they're supportive of the activities that we've been undertaking to protect. They recognize these sites as war graves, have sent us memos. They don't have any interest in recovery or anything of that nature, but they do respect that there are fallen soldiers in this location. So, and I'm sorry, your third question?
The military escorts on the convoy.
Oh yeah, I think that they were they kind of worked around them, but I believe that they were kind of all around them, and the aircraft would likewise have kind of a complete view of the site. So I don't believe that they were only on one side. Yes, sir.
We're seeing somewhere that one of the problems with the minefield that they made was that the Navy was so concerned about telling the Germans that it was there, they also didn't tell the American ships that it was there. So they didn't really know it was there.
So that's correct. So the question is, how much information was there on the minefields for, we wanted the Germans to know or not know, and how did that affect our Allied movements? And that's true. There were some vagaries as to what was there. They would have escort vessels that would lead you in through the minefield, and in and out of it. So if you remember a few slides back, well, probably several slides back, there's an image of what the minefield looked like, and it was what I call a double horseshoe. And so it was designed not really as it was a defensive element. It wasn't really designed to sink U-boats. It was designed to protect merchant ships. So because this area, for those of you guys that get out on the water here, you know how shifty the inlets are in North Carolina, and we don't have really good deep water access here. So Norfolk and really Wilmington were the 2 points in between that had any kind of deep water access, and this area was set up so that if they were only operating during the day, at night you could have safe harbor here. So it was an offshore safe harbor, so that's why you had these two horseshoes here. So to get in and out of it, you had to kind of know exactly where you're going. So they would have escort ships that would bring you in and out, and they wouldn't necessarily tell you much about where anything was. They'd just basically say, follow me, this is what you're doing. And in the case of the FW Abrams that was sunk, they were leaving, they had spent the night in there, and they were leaving the next morning and thought, oh, we're past the sea buoy and off we go. And it was a little foggy, and they got ahead of their escort, and that was that. So, yes, sir. I'm sorry, one more time?
Are any of the sites you're currently exploring within oil drilling lease sites?
So the question is, are any of the sites that we're currently exploring within oil drilling lease sites? And the answer to that is no. We coordinate closely with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management on a lot of the research that we're doing. They're one of our primary partners. So some of the work that we've done here is a lot of the areas that we're looking at are areas that are outside of some of their wind energy development areas and outside of the at least current lease areas for oil and gas.
How were the other three submarines destroyed, and in general, how would you describe aviation's role in all of this?
So the question is a great one. How were the other three German submarines off North Carolina destroyed, and what was aviation's role in this? And so the other three U-boats were all sunk differently, and in most cases they were sort of signal victories, or the first victory of their kind in the war. So the first one to be sunk was the U-85, and that was sunk by a four-stack destroyer called the USS Roper, and that was the first U-boat that was sunk off the East Coast. So it was sort of the first win that we had in this up until that point, really one-sided engagement. And if you remember, I said that they started sinking ships in January 1942. We didn't sink the first U-boat off the East Coast, which was the U-85, until mid-April. April 14th in 1942 is when the 85 was sunk. The U-352 was sunk in May of 42 as well. That was sunk by a Coast Guard cutter called the Icarus. So that was the first U-boat sunk by the U.S. Coast Guard during the war off the East Coast. And the U-701 was the first ship sunk by aircraft off the East Coast. So that was sunk by a Hudson with a captain named Harry Kane Jr. out of Cherry Point, North Carolina, who swooped in and dropped a pattern of depth charges on the U-701. Interestingly, the crew of the 701, they abandoned ship, and the majority of them were seen by the pilot on the surface of the ocean. He tried to radio to surrounding ships and said, "Hey, there's survivors in the water from this U-boat that I just sank. Come pick them up." And most of them heard U-boat and sped up in the other direction, and because they were concerned that there could be other U-boats in the area. And so these guys, the captain of the Hudson, the pilot, he estimated he saw about 40 guys on the surface, and when they finally picked them up 2 days later, there were only 7 of them, and they came back to Norfolk as POWs. But aircraft in general was critical to the Battle of the Atlantic, particularly as you got closer to Europe. Off of the East Coast, it was a little more problematic because everything was so spread out. and having continued air support was tricky. And there were areas in the Mid-Atlantic where operations changed based on the range of air coverage. So, but U-boats were very, very vulnerable to air attack.
Is there any concern that there's still some fuel oil or anything left inside these ships?
That's a great question. So the question is there any concern that there's fuel oil still remaining in any of these ships? And several years ago, NOAA undertook a study with our Office of Response and Restoration to assess that concern. We had a program that looked into not just the sites here, but kind of a comprehensive study looking at losses that happened in U.S. waters and trying to make a determination if any of those would present a significant environmental hazard based on retaining fuel oil. And there are a handful of sites around the country that are identified as potential concerns or high-level concerns because they were tankers, and in many cases they were full when they sunk. Most of the sites that are here, we haven't done super detailed assessments specific to fuel oil on these sites. There are a couple sites that if you're out on the water here, you've probably heard about, the Empire Gem and the Lansing, who are affectionately referred to as the smell wreck and the slick wreck, because you can still smell some bunker sea on the surface and occasionally see sheening. But in general, when these vessels were sunk, they burned at the surface for a long time if they carried a lot of fuel oil. And because many of them were in shallow water, they were also navigation hazards. So they ended up becoming target practice for aircraft that were practicing dropping things on U-boats. And then after the war, and even during the war, because they were navigation hazards, they were often wire dragged to make sure that they had, wouldn't sink other vessels, which did occur. So in the process of that, a lot of their significant stores would have been disrupted. But there are some sites that are in deeper water that are really intact that may have some reserves. Sir?
I'm assuming that the charts of that time weren't detailed as what we have today, so how were the U-boats able to navigate so well?
So that's a great question. The question is, how did the U-boats navigate so well off our shores? And charting and things at the time were not as good, and that's definitely true. One of the reasons that they were able to navigate so well is because we didn't black out our shores when we were told to. So they would they would have reasonably decent charts that were fairly updated, and they knew where the lighthouses were, and they were all still glowing, and the entrances to the Chesapeake Bay. The story of the 701 that was ultimately sunk, where the guys drifted, they were the only U-boat to successfully mine a U.S. port in the entire war. And they mined the Chesapeake Bay, and they did it by using Cape Henry and Cape Charles Lighthouse, and they hit 5 ships in one mine deployment there because all the navigational instruments were ablaze. So.
What is the career path and the significant life events of a boy from Ohio to end up underwater off the coast of North Carolina?
Obstinacy, I think. So the question is, what's the career path to end up working in North Carolina underwater from Cleveland, Ohio? I just got really interested in history and in diving. My father was a recreational scuba diver, and when I was 14, he said, "Hey, I'm taking this class where we're learning how to map shipwrecks. You'll probably think it's cool." And I thought, that sounds great. Plus, I get to skip out of school for a couple days, so I'll try that out. And I never stopped. So I've been pretty one-dimensional for the last 20 years or so.
I have a follow-up. There's a gentleman in front of you wearing a World War II vet hat.
Oh, excellent. Very good. We have a World War II vet in the audience. Thank you for your service. Yes.
Not North Carolina,
I'm sorry?
Patrick, our ship, I was a Coast Guard cutter, the night. We was laying in the mouth of Mississippi River,
Oh,
guarding ships going in and out of the river. We were even involved in the war. And all of a sudden, I was in the engine room. And nothing in those days was automated. Everything moved by hand. I was standing in front of one of the big diesels. And somebody hollered down the hatchway, said, Pearl Harbor's been bombed.
oh man.
95% of us, maybe 100%, didn't know what Pearl Harbor was.
Yeah.
We warmed up right quick and went up the East Coast to, I think it's Fort Lauderdale, Florida. She's equipped for a minesweeper and, a submarine chaser. And the rest of the war, I was in all these places you've been talking about.
Yeah.
I've been there. Believe it or not, I was there. And I was sinking, a part of a sinking submarine. And when we went around Cape Hatteras, we left New Orleans, Mississippi River, went around the Keys, come up the East Coast. When we went by Cape Hatteras, the ships were sunk there, looked like mothballs. The bows were sticking out, the sterns was on the bottom, the water was shallow, right off the Don shoulder. So we went down to New Jersey, and that's where we sank our first submarine.
Wow.
And I don't know one that was in that war.
He's 100 years old.
Wow. Unbelievable.
He was on the U.S. Coast Guard Cutter 90.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing that story, and it's just it's incredible. And those stories are so important to our heritage, and to World War II had a greater impact on the geopolitical landscape of the world that we live in now, and we have an opportunity to honor the story here off our shores. And so, thank you so much for sharing that. That was wonderful.
I could tell some.
I want to hear them all. Thank you so much.
So, of those ones that are sitting on the shelf, how stable is the shelf? Like, are any of them at risk of falling off? Or are they even that close?
So
to the edge?
this site is probably the one that we've looked at that's kind of closest to the edge of the shelf. But because of the geology of this region, it's not like a cliff face. It's more of it's a pretty sharp slope. There's some areas like Hatteras Canyon where you've got some really steep ridges, but so I don't know of any sites that are sort of teetering on the edge, at least not in like a literal sense. This is kind of closest to teetering, but yeah, I don't know of any sites that are in danger of really slipping into deeper water. That would be a cool movie, though.
So I have two questions. One, do the hurricanes that come off our coast affect these sites? And the other question is, are you doing any decompression diving on these wrecks?
Great questions. Yeah, so the questions are, do the hurricanes that happen off the coast affect these sites? And the second question is, are we doing any decompression diving on these sites? And the answer to both questions is yes. There are, as you know, as residents of this area, we can receive quite a heavy dose of weather from time to time. And the sites, particularly those in shallower water, can be affected. So we see it on some sites in different ways. So, for instance, a site like the 701 or some of these shallower sites, they're embedded in the seabed, and depending on various hurricanes or weather systems or nor'easters that come through, you can have a lot of scour or shoaling. So sometimes you'll go out to a site and it's almost entirely covered up. And then other times a storm will come through and it'll be completely unburied. So it's kind of changes throughout over the years. But it does have some implications on long-term preservation. If something's buried for a long time and then it becomes exposed, it usually looks pretty remarkable because it hasn't been exposed to the seawater, doesn't have quite as many organisms growing on it. That was the case with the 701. It's occasionally been buried and then revealed. And some sites will even move and shift. You see this more readily in a couple of the artificial reefs that have been put down. Where, big intact vessels can actually kind of roll along the bottom. This has happened down in like Beaufort area, but also famously in the Florida Keys. Some of the ships that they've sunk down there on purpose, a hurricane will come through and flip them upright. It's pretty remarkable what they can do. And then the second question for decompression diving is that yes, we do a pretty fair dose of decompression diving on these sites. There are a lot of amazing sites that can be visited that are within sort of recreational diving limits, up to about 130 feet of water. But then there's some really amazing sites that are in deeper water, and the monitor itself, which we primarily are responsible for, is in 240 feet. So for us to get there, it's required decompression. So most of what we do when we're putting people in the water these days is stage decompression with rebreathers. Any other questions? All right. Well, hey, I appreciate everyone spending their evening with me, and it's been lovely. Thank you.